It's 8:32 in the morning, Tuesday, October 22, 2019. I'm Trina Janay Condes, your reporter for this day. This is BBC World News, where the news come from. Today's headlines are about African social values. African social values are both man-centered and community-centered. This being the case, it is not a surprise that human dignity and the respect for human life are of supreme importance. The social values are tailored to ensure man's tenure of life right from birth until old age. Moreover, let's call Mr. Gab Quevedo for the other news report.
Thank you, Rina. Moral values in African culture is embedded in strong moral consideration. It is a system of various beliefs and customs which every individual ought to keep in order to live long and to avoid bringing curses on them and others.
Side by side with their high levels of commitment to Christianity and Islam, many people in the country have retained their beliefs and rituals. In 4 countries, for instance, half or more of the population believes that sacrifices to ancestors or spirits can protect them from harm. In addition to expressing high levels of belief in the protective power of sacrificial offerings, upwards of 1 in 5 people in every country say they believe in the evil eye or the ability of certain people to cast malevolent curses or spells. In most countries surveyed, at least 3 in 10 people believe in reincarnation, which may be related to traditional beliefs in ancestral spirits. The conviction that people will be reborn in this world again and again tends to be more common among Christians than Muslims. But most importantly, they or their culture perhaps possess the concept of supreme being, which they believe is invisible and indigenous. They hold a belief in the existence of the human soul and that the soul does not die with the body.
Democratic culture is an essential ingredient of political life of every nation. In Africa, democracy and good governance are fragile issues because they are devoid of traditional values that can sustain them. The failure in moral, ethical, and cultural conditions of Africa has been attributed to poor democratic ethos and system of governance. The fall of communism in 1989 made many people to believe that the time for democracy had finally arrived, and there was a ray of hope that would serve as a means to relieve the pains and sufferings of Africans.
Stretches across Africa from Senegal through to Tanzania, in which it is not uncommon for a third of married women to share their husbands. In the present day, this prevalence is almost unique to Africa. All demographic and health survey datasets report that at least 92% of married women are monogamous, except for those from Haiti and sub-Saharan Africa. Small known is the rate at which polygamy has declined in Africa in recent decades. In Benin, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Senegal, more than 60% of married women recorded in DHS data in 1970 were polygamous at the time they were surveyed. For women married in 2000, in these countries the polygamy rate is less than 40%. Several other countries with DHS surveys have experienced similar erosions of polygamy. The case of indigenous peoples provide a good example of the need to address the particularities of child labor. For many indigenous peoples, traditional education typically includes learning traditional occupations. History shows that learning traditional occupations in the form of light work has been more educative and the formal education system more disruptive in social, emotional, and economic terms. In spite of this, indigenous visions of education have only recently begun to be acknowledged in the design of formal education services, curriculum development, and teacher training. One of the reasons conservation in Africa is contested is that the prevailing discourse of saving the wild from the Africans doesn't stop to consider that the reason there is something to conserve is thanks to those same Africans. It is forgotten that the national parks in many African nations were started as hunting grounds for white men eager to prove their manhood, and in their creation, herders who contributed to creating and maintaining those ecosystems were forcibly removed.
Back to you, Serena.
Thank you, Gab. African culture do have a variety of beliefs to maintain their way of living. Now, let's call Mr. Alter Maliglig for his news report.
Thank you. Hey Trina, do you know the uniqueness of the African means of communication has actually made them to subsist and relevant in the contemporary world, despite the emergence of mass communication? If you listen to Africans communicating, you may be surprised if they seem blunt. That's because they are, and because they value honest communication. The use of loud voice, even though they are inches apart, is apparent. Silence in their culture means that there is lack of trust between the two persons, so they build their trust by having conversations. In nonverbal communication, the use and appearance of body parts are evident, which are influenced by the tribes found in countries in the continent. Dominant communication practices. Different countries inside of Africa have different interpretation of verbal and nonverbal communication. For example, Ghanaian citizens usually associate eye-to-eye communication as rude or disrespectful, but in other countries, it is okay. In Nigeria, the Yoruba tribe uses winking as an order to their children, but in other countries, it is for showing fondness. In South Africa, proximity while having a conversation is important to the locals. They also consider the peace sign rude if your palm is facing towards yourself. They also prefer the hang loose sign as a sign of greeting. Do you agree, huh?
Alter right. Africa really does have a diverse means of communication. Now, let's invite Ms. Maxine Villanueva and Mr. Carl Tolosa for their news report.
The unique thing about Africa is how mixed their cultures are. But let me share about the differences between North and South Africa. North Africa was colonized and influenced by countries from the western side of the globe, France, Spain, United Kingdom. And the arts and music here are really good. While South Africa, being the most diverse in culture and ethnicity, was influenced by cultures of Arabs, Hindus, Muslims, and cultures of their various tribes and groups. South Africa contains the countries that were labeled as the cradle of man, where the region where the modern hominids evolved. With that being said, there are things to keep in mind when traveling as a foreign visitor in Africa to maintain the respect of people towards you.
Another thing to remember is that there's a lot of things that you should not do as a tourist in Africa. There's a lot of people that have a very reserved view and are very traditional that cause them to have a rich culture.
In the United States, a short handshake would indicate self-confidence or masculinity within a person. A limp handshake done by a man can be seen as a sign of homosexuality or wimpiness. But in most parts of Africa, a limp handshake is the correct way to do it. Handshakes that would last for several minutes is common for Africans, while in the United States, a handshake that is even a few seconds too long is interpreted as familiarity, warmth, and possibly sexual attraction. Given the mixed cultures of Africa, there are distinctions that may or may not be the same with other cultures. First, the sole of your foot is considered to be the dirtiest part of your body, and that pointing your foot sole directly to anyone will be considered a bad sign. When eating, you have to eat with your right hand, for your left hand is used for other necessities other than eating, and that you don't talk much during a meal. Hissing and kissing sounds to call the attention of someone is completely normal. Silence is an African value, so it's not a problem if you all have a moment of silence in the middle of a conversation. Time in Africa is a little less important, which is similar to the culture of Filipinos, as it also teaches us to be flexible with our schedules. In Africa, we should not physically show our anger, frustration, and impatience to anyone. When receiving gifts, we have to receive them with both hands. And Africans have this tendency to not state their shortcomings. Lastly, positive communication, and relationships with everyone matter.
It is rude in Africa to simply point with your index finger. It may be a common thing to do in North America, but it can be misconstrued as disrespectful. Many ethnics made alternative to this, wherein people from Africa would motion their chin to the right and widen their eyes towards the point of interest. People from the North American region would motion for someone to come by pulling their fingers inward with the palm facing upward. This is another bad thing to do. Instead, you still pull your fingers, but you would point your palm downward. Finally, it is best to limit your talking when eating. Compared to Filipino dinners where everybody talks and shares stories while eating, African people reserve their business and important talks after they eat to show respect toward the people who prepared the feast.
As English evolved around the world, this phenomenon also happens in Africa, with words gaining new meanings, specifically used only in this continent.
With that being said, some examples of words that have different meanings are bagel, biscuit, and robots. For Americans, bagel means a bread product. For Africans, it means overly groomed, materialistic young man. For biscuit, for Americans, it means a cookie. For Africans, it's a term of affection. Lastly, for robots, for Americans, it means self-automated machine, while for Africans, it means traffic lights. The term shame, for Americans, it means sympathetic feeling. For Africans, it's an emphasis of cuteness. For China, for Americans, it means fake, while for Africans, it's a good friend. For just now, for Americans, it means past, while for Africans, it's an immediate future. Lastly, for fixed up, for Americans, it means prepared, while for Africans, that's good or sorted.
So that's it, Africa. Once again, we're BBC World News,
Where news comes from.